Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 6th APWF Webinar. My name is Yumiko Asayama, Manager of Japan Water Forum, and I'm also coordinating the Asia Pacific Water Forum. Today, we welcome Asian Development Bank and also the OECD to discuss about the water governance in Asia and the Pacific. This webinar will focus on the governance part of the Asia-Pacific Water Development Outlook 2020, which was issued last December. Today's speaker is Dr. Tom Panella, Chief Water Sector Group of Asian Development Bank, and also Dr. Maria Salvetti. She is Policy Analyst of the OECD. Before we move on to today's presentation, I would like to introduce today's operation of the webinar. After 25 minutes of the presentation, we will move on to the question and answer session, which is facilitated by Mr. Ravi Narayanan, our Governing Council Chair of the Asia Pacific Water Forum. He will firstly start asking questions to the speaker. Then we will have an interactive session with audience. During presentation, we also welcome your question through chat box. And during the Q&A session, it will be also very, very helpful if you raise hand, then ask questions to speakers. Thank you so much for your cooperation. And we now would like to welcome our Governing Council Chair, Mr. Ravi Narayanan, to deliver opening remarks of this webinar. Ravi, floor is for yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yumiko. A very warm welcome to all the participants of this 6th webinar on this very, very important issue, water governance in the Asia Pacific, lessons learned from AWDO 2020. Now, the last session was an AWDO, but in order to refresh your memories, Dr. Tom Panella, Chief of the Water Sector Group at the Asian Development Bank, will just start us off with AWDO. And then Dr. Maria Salvetti, Policy Analyst in the Water Governance Program of the OECD, will follow up with the details. I'm not going to go through their CVs because it will take the whole session if I do, because they're very distinguished people. So I'll request Tom now to start straight away to save time. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Let me share my screen with the presentation here. And we'll cue it up. So thank you. It's a pleasure for me always to support my Asia Pacific Water Forum friends. And it was a real pleasure actually to work through AWDO 2020 with OECD and a whole host of partners that I'll mention here shortly. As Ravi said, I'll just give a very brief intro to AWDO for those of you who are following the series and perhaps saw the launch and others. I'm not going to go through the AWDO document in detail, but just give you a bit of a flavor and overview of what AWDO is about. So with that, let me get into it here. So AWDO was released, launched on December 18th of 2020. And it's the 4th edition. Now what AWDO is a analysis of water security across 49 countries in Asia Pacific of ADB member countries. And it's a communications tool on water security, but more and more it's becoming a framework for developing policy and legislation, and Maria will talk more about that. And since the 2013 edition, we've had a quantified National Water Security Index, which provides a rating of a country's national water security, and I'll talk a bit more about this shortly. And that has been over the last 3 editions, and it's stayed pretty much the same, but I'll mention a few improvements. And I think most importantly, it's a effort of partners and would not have been possible without partners. Since the first edition in 2007 between ADB and Asia Pacific Water Forum, we worked closely this time with support from the Government of Australia, the International Water Center, now in Griffiths University, International Water Management Institute, the Korea Institute of Civil Engineering and Building Technology, and of course, the OECD, who's with us here today to talk about governance. And let me move to the next slide. AWDO is, as I said, a national water security index, and we have 5 key dimensions. The first is rural household water security, which is defined by access to water supply and sanitation, health, and affordability. The second is economic water security, access to water supply. Again, sorry, they have a bit of a problem with this slide. However, basically it's providing enough water at the right time to supply all sectors for optimum economic growth, and as well as the ability to weather extreme events and survive economically. Then we have water security, environmental water security, which is catchment and aquatic system health and environmental governance, and water related disaster security, which is climatological risk, which is flooding, storms, and drought. We have these 5 key dimensions. And I think most importantly is with let me go back to the latest edition was the addition of 2 chapters on finance and on governance, and that was provided by OECD. Those chapters, I think, really enhanced the richness of the document, and they're obviously cross-cutting across all key dimensions. In the last AWDO seminar, we went into a deep dive on the finance section, and now we'll look at governance. Now, as I said, there's a rating, a national security index that is a composite of those 5 key dimensions. So here we see the 49 countries that are rated across Asia and the Pacific, and we find that most are either engaged or capable. We only have 1 country that's nascent, which would be the lowest rating. We have several that are effective, which is the second to highest rating. And based on our criteria, none are model. And the effective ones are, not surprisingly, the developed economies across Asia and the Pacific. I think the other important thing to note is, as we've tracked it from 2013 to 2020, the general trend has been water security is improving. Notably, People's Republic of China moved from engaged to capable, and India has moved from nascent to engaged. That's nearly 2.5 billion people. improving their water security significantly. However, we still see many people living in a nascent or an engaged stage of water security, which we would consider being water insecure. So while the trend is positive, there is still much for us to do in the region. And we're AWDO, as I said, one, a communication tool, two, a guide for developing policies, but three, it also allows ADB to work with our clients to do a bit of a deeper dive on the issues affecting particular countries to improve their water security. And here, if you, let me go back one, this is just the rating of the different countries across Asia Pacific. And on this last slide, you have the link for AWDO if you want to download it for free. It's very easy, just Google it, ADB, AWDO 2020, and the publication is yours to download. That's a very, very quick overview. And with that, I'll turn it over to Maria to go into a deeper discussion of the governance, which I think was one of the most interesting part of the document. Thank you.
Well, Maria, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, Ravi. Let me share my screen. There we go. So thank you very much for allowing me basically to share with you today the some of the results of the work that we've been doing with ADB on water governance in Asia Pacific. I'll be sharing with you a little bit of the methodology that we use, just trying to set the scene, and then obviously turn on to some of the findings. I'll be drafting some of the policy sketching, some of the policy recommendations that we've put into this water governance in Asia Pacific a dedicated chapter, and then of course I'm happy to answer any question. So a few words about the methodology and how we proceeded. So basically, we use an analytical grid, which is the OECD principles on water governance that was adopted in 2015 by the OECD, and that was produced by a wide multi-stakeholder network and platform that is the Water Governance Initiative, that I can obviously describe a bit better later on. And those 12 principles, well, you have them on the screen. And for each of these principles, basically, we have asked questions through a survey that was sent. That was targeted to the 48 countries of the Asia Pacific region. So as you see in that survey, we have set up 46 questions distributed into the 12 water governance principles. These questions were mainly answered through secondary data and information. And through this survey, it allowed us to get an overview of water governance characteristics in Asia Pacific, also to get quantified evidence regarding governance gaps that I will be mentioning in a few seconds, and also to show the diversity of governance situations across the region. So let's now move on to some of the key findings Well, we have presented those key findings, you know, according to sub-geographic areas. Sorry about the acronyms, but here we have a Central and West Asia, East Asia, Pacific, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and advanced economies. And so for each of those geographical sub-region that are the ones, obviously, that AWDO, the publication AWDO is using, well, we have basically used a traffic light system trying to characterize the effectiveness, the efficiency, and the trust and engagement of governance. So in those areas, I will be in a second going into more details, but you can already see that for roles and responsibilities, well, there is a framework, governance framework that's in place and that's functioning in most of the countries. That's exactly what I'll be mentioning right now as part of some of the findings of the study. Well, we found that in most countries, there is an overarching water policy framework that is in place, either in the form of an environmental law or a specific water law. And what we found also is that this legal framework commonly mentions the human right to water and sanitation as recognized by the United Nations General Assembly on 28 July 2010. Also, what we have seen is that water policy coordination mechanisms are in place, as you can see, with 81% of countries in Asia Pacific having set up river basin organizations. And those organizations, they can be important tools for coordinating water policy at territorial level, across stakeholders, and between level of government. So these river basin organizations are important vertical and horizontal coordination tools. What we have also seen is that when there is a transboundary basin, well, transboundary agreements are in place between riparian countries and territories in almost all transboundary situations and basins. So that's really for the let's say the overarching principle and the legal framework. It's in place, and it's rather well functioning. Now, going into some aspects of governance that are not functioning so well, that could be definitely improved. Well, as you can see already, you know, on the graphs, you can see a lot of orange. And if you remember, you know, the traffic light system, it means that the governance aspect is in place, the governance principle is in place, but it's only partially functioning. And so what we've seen is that there was, let's say, a majority of countries in Asia that have adopted dedicated water policies. And as you can see, we have tried to focus on policies that are water-related disaster policies, WASH policies, so water and sanitation and hygiene policies, but also water policies dedicated to water quality and preservation. So we've tried to be pretty broad, you know, in the way that we've covered the meaning of water-related policies. So we see that a majority of countries have adopted those policies, that they tend to clearly indicate the goals to reach and the duties of the involved water institutions. However, what you can see, and this is the reason why there's quite a lot of orange, you know, on the graphs. What you can see is that most of these policies, and in the large majority of countries, these policies do not clearly indicate the resources that are needed to achieve the goals. And this generates unfunded mandates, and this is also hampering the implementation of those policies. In many countries also, the lack of financial resources is compounded by a lack of human resources and capacity. which prevents the timely and efficient implementation of investment projects and also those dedicated policies. Something that's also further hampering the implementation of those policies is the insufficient data and monitoring. Because as you can see, and this is already a result in itself, when we have tried to gather information on the existence of a water-related information system, well, in a majority of countries, well, we haven't been able to find some data. So the data on the existence of this water-related information, the data was not available, which in itself is an answer to the question. And that's, I mean, the situation is also to some extent a bit the same for water-related monitoring practices, as in a majority of countries there are no such monitoring. And obviously I was saying that this is hampering the implementation of water-related policies, because obviously if you cannot monitor and assess your policy and how you are efficiently and effectively implementing your policy, well then you are lacking some steering tools, for instance, to set up remedial action if your policy is not delivering properly on the ground, you know, the outcomes that you're expecting. So this lack of water of evaluation of the water policies is also reinforcing the low level of effective implementation of water policies. Another aspect that we've found is the limited uptake of water policy instruments to manage trade-offs. And on the two graphs, I'm just presenting a couple of water policy instruments. Of course, there are many of them, but we focused on a couple of them. And as you can see, there are in 79% of the Asia-Pacific countries, there is no policy instrument to allocate or monitor groundwater extractions. And this obviously represents a threat to water security, especially in areas where water stress is deemed to increase. In addition, the lack of conjunctive management of surface and groundwater sources, together with insufficient cross-sectoral coordination between agriculture, energy, and drinking water supply, is also resulting in over-abstraction of groundwater sources. And this is another result, you know, that really comes out of the AWDO publication. It's really the depletion of groundwater sources and the threat on groundwater sources. Also, what we've seen is that 2/3 of the countries have no water allocation regime in case of water scarcity or in case of emergency. So this is another water policy instrument that most countries are deprived of. On top of these water policy instruments, well, there are also economic instruments. What we see is that economic instruments can be used, you know, to manage water risks. But what we witness through the governance survey is that only 1/3 of the countries in Asia Pacific have implemented, for instance, abstraction and pollution charges. Of course, there are also other economic instruments than just abstraction and pollution charges, but these are the ones that we've been investigating through the governance survey. And obviously these are tools that are quite widespread across the world and across OECD countries to manage trade-offs with regard to water resources management, and also to manage water resources. So not having put in place those economic instruments, well, the countries are deprived of such tool that can be pretty efficient to achieve water resource management goals and targets that can be embedded into dedicated water policies. Moving on to another governance principle that is focusing on integrity practices and tools. Well, we also see that there is a limited uptake of those integrity practices and tools, as you can see on the graph, with less than 20% of countries that have implemented relevant international conventions, and that can also be a threat to water security, as for instance, investment can be discouraged by corruption practices, and this happens, in a context where investment needs are considerable and very important. Also, we found a figure, from the World Bank, saying that 20 to 40% of water sector finance is lost due to dishonest practices. So this really is also a key governance issue that needs to be addressed. Regarding the stakeholder engagement, well, there is also a limited stakeholder engagement, with less than 1% of the countries in the region having conducted a stakeholder mapping. So stakeholder mapping, obviously, I mean, you can live, without doing a stakeholder mapping, but the interest and the really the asset of doing a stakeholder mapping is that you identify all the stakeholders that have that should have a say in water related topics, issues, matters, and policies, and it helps you to identify who does what and how, at which scale, at which level. And this is really an important tool, really to set the scene and to make sure that you're not disregarding any important stakeholder. Also, you have obviously several ways, of engaging with stakeholders. You have several processes that you can see on the screen, from let's say basic communication to co-decision and co-production of decision, when there is a common decision making, so to speak. Also, you have formal and informal mechanisms, so there is a wide range of possibility, to engage with the stakeholders. So I'll stop there for the let's say some of the key governance findings and some of the key governance gaps that we have identified, and challenges that we have identified. As I was saying, through this governance survey, we were able to gather an overview and to produce an overview of the water governance characteristics, but it's really a helicopter view. And so the governance, the policy recommendation that we're making, we've tried to tailor them also at the geographic sub-region that you can see here again. So Central and West Asia, East Asia, Pacific, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and advanced economies. And we've tried to focus on really the priority area of action with regard to water governance improvement. And so, as you can see, well, for quite some regions, some sub-regions, well, managing trade-offs through the implementation of water policy instruments would be one of the key priority action. Improving stakeholder engagement would also be an important step to make for quite some regions, and so on. So I like to discover those recommendations that are targeted to geographic region. But just to sum up, some of the key recommendations. Well, strengthening the implementation and the monitoring of water-related policies. Sorry, I'm missing one word there. Well, this, as I said, is quite essential, because I mean, policies are well defined, the goals are clearly indicated, but the resources needed are not put up front and clearly assessed through short, medium, and long-term assessments. So this needs obviously to be addressed. And also the monitoring, the evaluation of those policies needs to be enhanced in order to try to have an efficient and effective implementation of those policies. Adopting water policy instruments to manage trade-offs, I've just mentioned that a few seconds ago, so I won't go into much more details. Adopting also water economic instruments, both to manage water resources, and the magic of it is that it also generates sustainable funding, you know, to fund water policies, water resource management policies, and also in water economic instruments. Of course, there is water and sanitation services tariffs that are useful to manage, obviously, water and sanitation services and water supply, and they also generate funding to sustainably manage water and sanitation services. Addressing capacity and data gaps obviously it's closely tied with the capacity to monitor the implementation of water-related policies, but you cannot manage what you cannot assess, you know, so you really need to have those data and those water-related data system, information system in place to properly monitor your policies and your action and see how they deliver, if they deliver on the ground. The capacity also is another important issue, and here, you know, when I'm talking about capacity, I'm not only referring to technical knowledge and expertise, you know, in terms of planning, rulemaking, project management, finance, budgeting, risk management, and evaluation. But I'm also, I mean, we're also thinking about a capacity gap in terms of staff, you know, the number of staff, but also capacity in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the assets. Being obsolete, being aging, being old. So it's really a comprehensive, let's say, a capacity gap that needs to be addressed. Developing further stakeholder engagement in water decision making. I've also elaborated quite a lot on that, so I won't be going into much more detail on that. And obviously mainstreaming integrity and transparency practices is also another key aspect, because as I was mentioning, you know, 20 to 40% of water sector finance that is lost due to those dishonest practices. Well, it's definitely a huge issue that needs to be addressed, taking into account the huge investment needs in the region to properly manage water risks. Too little water, too much water, too polluted water, and access to water and sanitation. So I'll stop there for my presentation, but I'm obviously very happy to answer your questions and go a bit more into details as you wish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Tom, for that presentation. I think each slide is so rich in content that it throws up a lot of questions. But let me try and roll some of these questions to start off the discussion in an omnibus way. First, Maria, this is to Maria. Maria, you know, you've got a lot of policy recommendations. Is there a way of assessing the link between those recommendations and improvement in water security? In other words, can we say, if you press this button, you'll get this improvement, et cetera, et cetera. Added to that, you know, is the situation the same in very large, complex countries which are multi-jurisdictional? In other words, you know, you have different roles and responsibilities at the city level, at the province level, and at the central state level. And then, of course, there is, you know, generally, we find that in the Asia Pacific, you have terrific people at the top, and then you descend into a morass of mediocrity. So how does one fight the issues of building capacity from the bottom up? So I don't know whether those questions are too large, but I'll hand it over to Maria, and then Tom, perhaps you could chip in. Maria.
Thank you very much, Ravi. So if you allow me to share my screen again, to answer your first question, well, at the end of the water governance dedicated chapter, in AWDO 2020, we actually tried, to make a link, sorry, between water governance and water security, which obviously is not something easy to do, because the let's say cause to consequence relationship is extremely difficult to establish, and obviously we believe at OECD that water governance can contribute to water security, but it's obviously it doesn't do it all. So what we've tried to do is really to look at how the countries were performing with regard to some of the key dimensions that Tom mentioned in his presentation, and see if the corresponding principle was governance principle was properly implemented, well functioning, using the traffic lights that I presented at the very beginning of my presentation. And what we can say, is that when we look at the countries that have implemented allocation and monitoring regime for groundwater extraction, well, we see that those countries that have implemented that kind of water policy tool and instruments, well, they are the countries that are, according to KD5, performing the best, or some of the best, with regard to water-related disaster resilience. So here, I mean, we cannot definitely say that there is a cause-consequence relationship very hard and statistically established. We cannot say that there is a high correlation from a statistical perspective, but we can just say that the best performing countries for water-related disaster resilience are the ones that have mainly adopted water policy instruments to allocate and monitor groundwater extraction. When we look at KD3, we have about the same kind of, let's say, finding so KD3 being the urban water security, and the countries that have the highest score for urban water security, they are also the countries that have adopted key performance indicators for water and sanitation services. So as of today, this is how we are approaching, this is very preliminary work, and that's how we are approaching the link between water governance and water security. But I also have to really be complete in my answer, not wanting to speak too long, but I have to say that the water governance initiative that I was mentioning at the very beginning of my presentation is working in one of its two working groups. There is one that is dedicated to impact indicators. So trying really to build up some impact indicators that would show the impact of water governance on water security, and water security for us at OECD being defined as managing water risks, managing too much water, too little water, too polluted water, and access to water and sanitation. And so we are, of course, as I was saying, the causal link between input, so policies, and outputs, so quality of water, quantity of water, and risk management is very difficult to establish. But the idea really is to see the impact of water governance and the contribution of water governance to water security. I'll stop there for that question. Well, regarding, I'll jump to the capacity one, because regarding the capacity, well, we found, in the water in the governance survey, we found that the capacity gap that is observed is not restricted to subnational level. but it really seems to apply to all levels of government, because we found that only 1/3 of the countries in Asia Pacific, they have adopted guidelines and standards for capacity building across authorities at all levels. So we really believe that it's unfortunately a widespread gap, if I may say, across levels of government. But I'll stop there because I want to let Tom also jump into the conversation.
Tom, do you want to supplement that?
Yeah, just on the capacity issue, I think part of it is in many countries, you're also inheriting quite large, inefficient bureaucracies too, that where public service may also not be paying the best salaries to attract the best people either. And so it's also very hard to attract quality staff and retain quality staff in some cases to stay and build the capacity needed to run the public enterprises, and then also just the overall management structure and accountability and performance metrics, which are all part of governance, may not be in place to help ensure that the water, this is in the case of water service provision, is there. So really establishing that link of capacity and what capacity is needed to get to the improved outcomes may not be entirely clear, or may just not be high enough on the priority agenda of some governments. I'll leave it at that.
And maybe Ravi, to get back to your second question that I don't want to overlook. Well, indeed, you know, we are at OECD, we are using the OECD principles on water governance at different scales. So for instance, we're doing what we call water policy dialogues at national scale. And we're currently performing one at city level. The idea, you know, just to answer your question, is that basically those principles, you can apply them and really use them to perform a sort of diagnosis of water governance, no matter what the scale is, you know, because what we see also, we're working on water governance in African cities, for instance, and what we see is that cities, obviously, they do not have in hand all responsibilities for water resource management, but to some extent, they do still have some responsibilities, and it's important to be mapping. So I'm getting back to that stakeholder mapping. It's important to be mapping who does what, how, and at which level of government, and really we believe that applying this analytical grid that the OECD principles on water governance is providing at city level, at river basin level, or at national level really provides stakeholders with the diagnosis of the characteristics, the gaps, obviously, and the challenges in terms of water governance. And then there is a co-construction. You know, I was showing you this graph on the stakeholder engagement. Well, in those water policy dialogue, we do co-construct and co-produce common and shared policy recommendations with local stakeholders. And that's what we're currently doing, for instance, in Cape Town, South Africa, you know, through the water policy dialogue that we're doing over there. So that what I'm trying to say is that the scale is not so much of an issue as long as you are identifying and engaging with all the responsible institutions and the stakeholders that have a stake at water issues and water policy.
Thank you. And presumably all the multi-stakeholder fora are manned by people with a certain capacity to be able to analyze and communicate. That's a given, isn't it? Otherwise, you'll have a lot of noisy rooms full of people shouting and not making much sense. Okay, thank you.
Ravi?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was one question, and it's well founded that this presentation I used was not my presentation, and the slide was confused on the key dimensions, and I apologize. If I get 1 minute, I can just go through them very quickly with something much better for people who aren't familiar, if you can allow me that.
Please do, Tom.
Okay. Okay. People can you see the screen, or are you also seeing the chats on the screen? Sorry, can you see the just the screen at the presentation, or
yes, we can see the presentation.
Yeah, okay, so this is key dimension 1, which is access to rural water security, which is access to water supply, sanitation, health impacts, and affordability. Economic economic water security, which is the measure of assurance of adequate waters to sustainably satisfy countries' economic growth, accommodate economic losses due to water-induced disasters. And urban water security, again, access to water supplies, sanitation, affordability, but also includes drainage and environmental components. Environmental water security, which is catchment and aquatic ecosystem health and environmental legislation. And water-related disaster, which again is basically flood, drought, and storms. And again, it was my apologies very much on that presentation that wasn't clear. And I hope that clarifies things. Over.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, now we're on to, shall we throw the floor open for questions and comments? So, Yumiko, how do we want to take this? Do you want to go into the chat box or the Q&A box?
Yes, firstly, I would like to ask you a response to the question from our colleague from Bangladesh. He's asking the way to enhance the stakeholder engagement, specifically where there is already existing conflict of interest. Is there only policy dialogue is a good way, or in addition to the policy dialogue, what recommendation do you have? What OECD or ADB can recommend through your outcome and experience? Thank you.
I suppose that goes into the area of trade-offs, does it?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I mean, regarding, the stakeholder engagement, I mean, there are so many, let's say, obstacles that can hamper stakeholder engagement. Obviously, conflict of interest is one of them. Hijacking of meetings, for instance, if stakeholder engagement happens in meetings, is another one. Stakeholder engagement fatigue is another one. So we have also, let's say, an analytical grid, trying to assess why and how the stakeholder engagement doesn't happen, or what are the issues that are at stake, and then that are preventing stakeholder engagement to happen. And obviously, depending on the let's say the diagnosis that we're making of the obstacles and the impediments of stakeholder engagement, then we can come up with options for policy recommendation. But it's always very hard to be speaking on a very generic perspective, and because there is no one-size-fits-all solution. So that's why I was saying that the governance survey that we did is an overview, is a helicopter view of the water governance situation in Asia Pacific, and an overview of the characteristics. But in those water policy dialogues that I was mentioning, because we're focusing much more on a dedicated city, basin, or country, we meet up with all the stakeholders. The water policy dialogue that we did in Argentina last year, well, we met with more than 130 stakeholders at local level, national level. The one that we're doing in Cape Town this year, with the COVID pandemic situation, well, we managed, to exchange and engage with more than 80 stakeholders. So obviously, when you have this sort of in-depth work, with stakeholders, then you can come up with a really precise and specific policy recommendation. But out of the blue, it's kind of difficult to come up with a specific recommendation for conflict of interest in the situation that was mentioned by the participant. But we do have tools, to analyze the situation.
Just to build on that, the point you raise also indirectly addresses, and this is the point I think that Tony Slatcher raises, is, in his question was, why do so few countries, have policies for rationing scarcity? Well, as you well know, that, typically water is governed in a very federated way. So if you're looking at national policy, you may be just touching the tip of the iceberg in many cases for what is water governance. Certainly India, Australia, other countries, much of the governance and the nitty-gritty takes place at the subnational level. So it's also very, very hard to get a picture, a granular picture, just at looking at national policies. So again, as Maria said, that by really you need to go into a geographic scale and then look at the different stakeholders, which would be also different levels of government who have different roles and responsibilities. Again, that's part of the confusion or the challenge of dealing with governance, because there may be overlapping mandates, unclear mandates. So again, it is a challenge, and that's, I think, also why the dialogue is so important. Over.
Thank you. And we have received several questions from Mr. Robert. Mr. Robert, if you can ask question directly through your voice, it will be very, very helpful.
Robert Boss, are you there?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button. Yes, thank you very much. This was a very interesting session, and I really enjoyed the details of the work that has been done by OECD and ADB. And of course, it reminds me of when I was in WHO and the work we did with GLASS, which is also working with OECD on some of these enabling environment issues.
Mr. Robert, it is muted.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. And so I have a few questions. One I sent by email yesterday, which is about the issue of the human rights to water and sanitation, because I think that I don't hear much about that from the Asia Pacific region, but there are examples from Africa where bringing human rights to water and sanitation into the legislative framework and sometimes into the constitution has helped to strengthen the regulatory framework. And one thing that it has done, for instance, in Kenya, is to enable the incorporation of the informal water providers, especially in marginalized urban settings, to become part of the regulatory framework and therefore improve issues around affordability and also water quality. My other question is about the fragmentation that was raised, and which is, of course, a perennial problem with water use. And that is to see what can be done to strengthen the entrance points into water through things that are cross-cutting by nature. And of course, economics is an obvious one and is dealt with normally. But I would say if we would be able to bring in health and environment as cross-cutting issues in the planning through health impact assessment and environmental impact assessment, we would have an instrument to get intersectoral action between these fragmented sectors to implement the associated plans. So I'd like to hear the panel's opinion on that. Thank you.
Tom, do you want to start?
Yeah, certainly I'll take a crack at that. You know, on the human rights aspect, that is a sovereign decision, and you know, so as a financing institution, we certainly support universal access and finance and design all our policies for universal access and focus on, you know, the vulnerable, the poor, marginalized. How the country may want to go about doing that. It's interesting, the case you raised about it bringing in informal water providers, as well as being able to improve tariff collection. I mean, one of the concerns that has been raised about taking a rights approach also is somewhat of the converse, that if people perceive it as a right, that, well, you know, they don't need to pay for the service provision since they have a right to water. So I think it's all about the details and how that argument is used then to trickle down in the legislation. And I thought that the Kenya example seems a very positive one. I've also heard the opposite negative side on that. And on the integration, certainly the current COVID pandemic has changed how ADB is addressing things in exactly the way you said. Our water and health programs have really strengthened. We have a new water and health advisory team, and all our water programs are really now incorporating health outcomes into the design, or at least the analysis. And you know, we're even doing disaster flood programs that incorporate health for pandemic because of COVID. So in some ways, you know, COVID has presented opportunities to accelerate some of these situations. And again, I would also say it's brought the WASH and the water resources and climate change communities together, which always weren't hanging out together so closely in the water world. But I think it's also accelerated that. I'll stop with that and see if Maria has something to add. Oh,
Maria?
Thank you very much, yeah, Tom. No, just building on what Tom just said, you know, I would stress that the current COVID context shows the critical importance of access to water and hand washing facilities, which is boosted basically by the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation. But beyond infrastructure and investment, adequate access to clean water and sanitation also needs reliable water governance systems clearly identifying who does what, who pays for what, why, and how. And well, the OECD has worked extensively on these issues under its water governance program, and with its principles on water governance. So the principles of the OECD really support countries in effectively implementing legal frameworks that have triggered major evolution in water policy, including the United Nations General Assembly resolution on the human rights to water and sanitation. And just one last word, because the time is running. Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, using the analytical grid provided by the OECD principles on water governance, we look at obviously fragmentation and then working in silos, and one of the principles is about policy coherence. This is the principle number 3, encouraging policy coherence through effective cross-sectoral coordination. So really for us, looking at how the policies are or are not coordinated, this is really a key aspect, especially when we're talking about policies for water, the environment, health, energy, agriculture, industry, spatial planning, waste management. Overcoming fragmentation, we look at this issue through coordination, cross-sectoral coordination of policies and coherence of policies, for instance. I'll stop there.
I think we've come to the end of a very, very interesting session. Both the presentations and the discussion that followed have revealed the possibilities, but also the measure of the challenges in front of us. It seems to me that in general, in the Asia Pacific region, people know what to do, but it's a question of the how to that is the big challenge. And that is something that has to be taken case by case and example by example. There's no magic bullet. Now, there are more questions to be asked, and I would encourage you to write them down and send them to Yumiko-san, and she will then try and get responses from Maria and Tom through email. That might be the most efficient, because clearly the subject is so vast and so interesting that no face-to-face session can answer all the questions. So if you're content with that, I'd like to thank all of you. Please join me in thanking the panelists, Tom and Maria, for their fascinating presentations and their insights into the issues of water governance in the region, in the Asia Pacific region. Yumiko, do you have anything else to say before we wind up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for wrapping up our presentation and of this webinar. And also thank you so much for your facilitating the Q&A with the speakers and also audience. And I also specifically thank you for Maria and also Tom for very concise presentation and also explanation of your research outcome with your experience. Thank you so much. And as Ravi mentioned, we will respond to all the questions received in Q&A box as well as chat box. And if you have also further questions, please send email to me anytime you want. Then I will ask either Maria or Tom to respond to your question. Thank you so much for your participation to this webinar. I hope you had a very useful through today's presentation and also discussion. I thank you so much for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So before we conclude of this webinar, please give me the opportunity to introduce the next APWF webinar. Next APWF webinar will be organized in 4th February. The speaker is Dr. Mark Smith, Director General of International Water Management Institute, and he will talk about the IWRM to build water security and what are the lessons for food system, climate adaptation, and inclusive growth. So this discussion will be the IWRM from the perspective of agriculture agriculture. And this also includes a discussion about the way of food system transformation, climate change resilience, advancing economic inclusion, and also gender equality. I hope you can kindly continuously join our APWF webinar. Thank you so much for your participation, always. And last and not least, today's presentation document and today's recording will be available from the APWF homepage. And also, the registration information will be also available from APWF website. Yes, so thank you so much for all your participation and contribution to today's webinar. Maria, thank you, and Tom also thank you, and I also thank you for all audience. Now I would like to close to this webinar. Thank you so much for your participation. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye.